Okay, Hasso, can you go to the next slide?
Sure.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is part of our Toilets to Tenants series. And Toilets to Tenants is basically a Denver networking group for landlords. We've got a Facebook page. We do periodic meetings. It's a good way to understand new rules and regulations and also to share with other landlords. This is sponsored by myself. I'm a local real estate agent, and Vanessa McLennan, who's part of Universal Lending. And Vanessa, I don't know if you want to quickly say hello.
Hi, everybody. I'll not take up much time. So go ahead, Nina.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Vanessa. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Hasso, and Hasso has actually spoken to our group before. So he's kind of a multifaceted individual because he also owns rental properties, but he's also one of the local inspectors. So as many people know, that's kind of a new rule that you do need to get your rental properties inspected. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Hasso. Go ahead, Hasso.
Thank you, Nina and Vanessa. Really appreciate you guys. Thanks for having me here. I wrote a book called Protest Your Property Taxes and Win, literally last assessment cycle, because I was so incensed at the assessor, I think stepping way out of bounds in how I feel the assessment process should work. And so I'm here to help all of you kind of learn how to protest your taxes if that's something you decide to do. And just a little more about me. I own and manage 40 plus rental units in Denver Metro. I've submitted a little more than 150 assessment protests. I'm also a licensed Denver rental licensing inspector for the new licensing program. And I'm the only landlord who's an inspector for that. And I've been licensed as a real estate agent since 2001. I've actually written 3 books on real estate that are on Amazon. And that's kind of a highlight about me. First of all, I want to talk about should you protest? And I think the truth is that taxes are a necessary thing and they help make our society great. And property taxes pay for schools, fire, police, and other essential services. And some of us have been complaining that maybe there needs to be a little more police enforcement around some of the crime issues we're seeing more of. So property taxes serve a valuable purpose. And so we do have a duty as citizens to keep our county and our country a good place to live. But I think more and more I feel government is not fulfilling their duty of being honest and following their own laws, specifically about property taxes. And for those of us who are landlords, for me, property taxes increases are a major driver of rent increases. And as we have the legislature talking about rent controls and affordable housing with one side of their mouth and then increasing taxes with the other side of their mouth, I think it's good to just hold that mirror up to our elected officials. And lots of us have heard that, oh, it's the no doc, no income verification loans that caused the 2008 housing crash. The part that I have not heard people talk about, it's how the assessor in 2006 and 2007 was using fraudulent inflated sales to comp other properties. And they basically elevated property valuations above what the market really supported. And then banks were giving these zero closing cost, no fee, low fee loans using basically desktop underwriting and desktop appraisals, where they were using inflated assessor valuations to lend money on valuations that weren't there on the real estate. And I think that's a part of the 2008 crash that's been ignored. And if we allow the assessor to get away with wrong or overly inflated valuations, we're helping them destabilize that aspect of our economy again. So we have a responsibility as citizens to point out errors in their assessments. And then, we're hearing this, like, I literally have property taxes on some of my rentals doubling as the same politicians that need that money advocate rent controls for the tenants. So let me tell you what your assessed value is and how this works. So basically, property taxes are calculated based on the old value of real property at the end of June last year. And you're allowed to use comps from anywhere in that 2-year period ending June 30th, 2022. That's called the basis period. But they could also use, and the assessments that we're getting right now are the taxes we'll pay next year. They could use the as improved value of your property on January 1st of 2024. So if on June 30th, 2022, you bought a fire damaged property at half price, and then you restored it so that on January 1st next year, it's worth $500,000 instead of the $200,000 you paid for it, they get to tax you on $500,000. My mom just had somebody in her condo in the building where she owns a condo set fire to a bunch of units. And so now there's a bunch of units that are just charred husks. That value, the assessor will just be like, no, that's the June 30th value, not the current husk. So it's kind of a one-way street on that, but it's just good to know that. And then the assessor uses a bunch of multipliers that kind of obfuscate most people even understanding or having any good sense of their property value, which I think just makes it harder for the average person to protest, and which is why I'm hosting this webinar, because I think we all deserve to have a voice in our democratic processes. So they'll use things assessed value, which is actually a fraction of market value. And then when they bang up all the assessed values in Denver against their Denver budget, that creates the mill levy of what you multiply assessed values by to create the property taxes owed. And I think all that is really irrelevant. Like, all you need to look at is market value. And then if you're determining if it's worth your time to protest, for every 100,000 of market value, Denver collects roughly $550 in taxes. So if you have a $100,000 condo, you owe $550 in taxes. If you owe $1 million house, it's $5,500 in taxes. So there's a 3-step appeal, and you have to do this first initial written appeal, which is due by June 8th, in order to preserve your right to do the second appeal. So when you file that initial written appeal, you might get a token reduction. So what I see the assessor do, they're like, oh yeah, got your appeal. I asked for the value to be halved. They'll take $16,000 off the value and hope that I just kind of accept that and go away. What I generally do, unless they really meet me where they should, file the second written appeal, and then that will culminate in a hearing with a independent appraiser hired by the city. And sometimes I wonder how independent they are, because it's been slow for appraisers lately. And so they like these kind of city gigs, and they do want to get hired back in 2 years. But it's better than just having a vociferous assessor employee reviewing your data. And then if you're still not satisfied with the outcome of that independent reviewer at the hearing, you could do another appeal. And I've done this, and I found that the deck is heavily stacked against me. This is where you'll get 3 city attorneys and 3 appraisers, and they'll have those kind of legal techniques like, have you ever told a lie? And if you say no, you're lying. And if you say yes, they discredit you. And so it's really hard to win that. I've also found that board will, instead of saying the truth is in the middle, they'll either say the assessor was right or you were right. And the odds are they'll say the assessor was right. So I found it's not worth doing that third step. But the second step, I've gotten some good reductions, and I'll show you a case study on that later. So when you look at your property tax assessment that you just got in the mail, I tend to see a ton of errors once I start looking at each property. And a big one is they'll use higher valued single family homes as comparables for your condo or your row home or your HOA property, comping it with a non-HOA property. If you have any kind of multifamily, they might have your unit count wrong or use comps with different unit counts. What I see all the time, I have a duplex in Denver Southeast. They used a wash park comp that's 4.9 miles away. And the other comps were 8 miles away. So any appraiser would be like, you can't use that. The assessor breaks appraisal rules all day long. The other thing I see commonly, comps from a sheltered cul-de-sac for your busy arterial, like if you're on Colfax and they'll use a comp on 21st Avenue, something like that. I talked about the HOA. I've seen it where they'll use a half-acre lot comp for my 3,000 square foot lot, and they won't adjust for it adequately. I talked a little bit about the fraudulent, problematic, non-representative sales. So I had bought some row houses out of foreclosure in 2008, and I knew that they could never have sold based on their condition for what the assessor showed them having sold at. But the assessor used those comps on properties I owned 8 miles away because they loved that fraudulent sales price. So sometimes it's worth calling the real estate agent who sold it and asking if that really held water, and seeing if you can investigate some of those sales, and just asking the assessor to disqualify some sales. The thing the assessor does all the time in the basis period, some flipper will buy a property for $300,000, redo all the cosmetic things, and sell it for $500,000. And the assessor could have used the $300,000 sale as the comp for my $300,000 rental, but they'll use the granite, new roof, new furnace, new windows, new paint, new carpet, $500,000 comp as a comparable for my tired working class rental. So just pointing that out to them, and like, actually, a $300,000 sale is the right comp to use. They hate that, but you would be right, and you might really win on your protest. In Denver, I own one property. We've had 7 site visits. They still list on their data card that it's a brick stucco home when it's actually flatboard, like hardy backer siding, like just garbage, paper mache. And the other thing you'll see, they'll use a newer house built in the 80s, which has bedrooms that'll fit a king size bed, to comp some Victorian that has tiny bedrooms that you can barely fit a twin into, and not accounting for that. Obsolescence is what we call that. So when you get your assessor evaluation, in Denver, you'll get like 4 or 5 comps. Jeffco doesn't even give you comps anymore. They'll just give you the statistical method. But with Denver, what I do is, first of all, pick apart their comps and say, you use the flip version when mine's not a flip, disqualify all their comps for all the reasons listed, and then submit my own comps that are better. And everybody's busy, so the more you can use pictures, give all the full color pictures so people can be like, yeah, that's not a good comp. You're saving everybody a lot of reading and time, and helping them give you a better decision with less effort. And I'm totally eager to have questions at any point that makes this presentation more lively. I want to talk about time adjustments real quick, and jump in at any time, Nina and Vanessa, but
actually, Hasso, I had a quick question on your previous slide. You mentioned finding comps on the MLS.
Yes.
In the neighborhood, and you know that there's some first sale by owners, can you use those as comps?
You can only use closed comps from the time period ending last June. But if they were sold by owner and there's a sale in the system, you can absolutely use those.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and what you're hinting at, Nina, is your question is interesting in that I feel like the market has dipped somewhat since June of last year, and the assessor gets to ride on that. That was like the very high point of our market, and now our values are lower, but they get to tax us on a value that no longer exists in our house. And that's just the unfortunate fact of the assessors. Go for it, Vanessa.
Do you want me to read the questions in the chat?
Please, yeah.
Okay. So they're coming in. Kelly Dallas said, I have a 4-bedroom place. The city thinks it's a 3-bedroom. The comps are based on 3 bedrooms. If I protest, I would assume I need to come clean with the 4 bedrooms I have. What should I do?
That's a great ethical question. That's a really hard one to answer.
But also, to be fair, it looks like one of the bedrooms is actually non-conforming, so it doesn't have an egress. It's in the basement. So I'm not sure the city would count that as a bedroom.
I didn't see that.
They usually don't do site visits. So, I mean, I would protest against the data they submit. I mean, I think if you can ethically feel like you're, if it's not really a fully conforming bedroom, it's a 3-bedroom. And if a buyer might discount it as a bedroom, they already know it's a 3-bedroom. Just protest using better 3-bedroom comps.
Does a non-conforming basement bedroom count as much as a conforming bedroom? And
absolutely
that was you guys were just talking about.
Yeah, and I've seen basements be worth like 1/5 of the value of the above ground square footage. So I think that is kind of in the margins anyway. But what I find is they'll take a larger lot or a fully remodeled. Like if I look at the pictures of their comps on Zillow, or if Nina or Vanessa sent you guys comps, you'd be like, wow, they have brand new cabinets and quartz counters and all the modern stuff. And if your house doesn't, it's worth less, even though the assessor pretends they're worth equally much.
In Jeffco, you said statistical method is used. What does that mean?
That's a really great question, because I don't know what it means and they can't explain it. What they'll tell you is some mumbo jumbo, like we take a market basket of houses and calculate the average value and then project it onto your house. And I'm like, what the expletive does that mean? And they're like, yeah, it's statistical analysis, and they pretend like it's some giant science. And I'm like, it's just as much garbage as Zillow or some of those fake home valuation sites. And what they do is give you less to point out errors, and they just pretend it's science, and some person with a PhD came up with this number, so it's right. It's garbage, and you still have actually a kind of obligation to yourself to protest it if it doesn't look right. And that's a great segue into this time adjustment. Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England in the late 1800s, said there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics. And the assessors use something called a time adjustment. So if you had a house, like let's say you bought your house. Actually, this is a good example. I bought my house in September of 2022, in September of 2020, just after the beginning of the basis period. They're using a 35% time adjustment, which adds $400,000 in theoretical value to my house that they want to tax me on. But the fact is, if I look at highway-facing properties in my neighborhood, they don't go up that fast, but they're pretending they do because on average, houses do. And so in Denver, for this assessment period, the assessor claims values went up 29 to 40%. And I called an assessor office employee, and he's like, there's bulk appraisals and mass assessments based on property class and a given cluster. And he was giving buzzword bingo. And then I asked him to explain it, and he couldn't. But the outcome of their bingo here is that a duplex went up in value from $464,000 to $936,000. And my tenants aren't fixed income, and they can't necessarily afford this. And that's putting everybody in a hard spot. And the fact is, when I use the MLS to run time adjustment calculations, depending on what property style and what neighborhood and distance from my subject, I can create a decline in value, I can create a flat value, or I can create a phenomenal increase like they like to pretend. And it's worth noting, Lawrence Ewan is the chief economist for the National Association of Realtors, and he published statistics to us and the government about the great housing crash in 2008 through 12. He admitted, and years later after the crash, that he faked the statistics and made them look better by 20%, saying that values had dropped 30% when they had actually dropped by 50% to help stabilize consumer confidence. But even famous people who are trusted with data lie about the data. And here's a really great case study. So this is actually the house I live in. The previous owners bought it during the last assessment basis period for $945. And then I bought it in this assessment basis period for $972. And this is the end of the last period. The assessor pretended it was worth this much. And yeah, they were just trying to collect an extra $3,000 in taxes, essentially. I was able to, they ignored my first protest. Then at the appeal, the assessor employee was really combative. He was kind of yelling, interrupting me, not doing the due process that I thought it should be. But in the end, the independent arbiter agreed with my case and did the value. I can't see the right part of my slide, but it was like in the 980s. Now, I just yesterday got my new appraisal. Even though I bought it for $972 at the beginning of this assessment period, they're saying it's worth $1.6 million. So the assessor is even to the point where they ignore the property sale in the assessment period, and they just use other comps to pretend like it should have been worth more. Even though if you were to look at the for sale price, they kept dropping it until it ended like right north of 972. So we do have a duty, if the assessor is egregiously wrong, to let them know that. And just being in a lot of these hearings, I've heard assessor employees say some things that really kind of make me scratch my head, like all real estate agents are liars, or that the MLS is more often than not wrong. Because I challenged them. They had a comp that they said was 800 square feet, which was a comp for my 800 square foot rental. But on the MLS, it said it was 1,600 square feet and had 2 extra bedrooms and an extra bath. And they're like, yeah, the MLS lies. We're still going to use, they were using their assessor data. And I'm like, why don't you look at the pictures? They also said, just because I'm protesting, that I'm a tax evading liar. And because I was protesting, they threatened to raise my valuation higher if the independent arbiter had disagreed with my case. And I believe that's illegal, but they'll do stuff like that. And there's still, a process of law in the United States. And I think we still have to stand up for ourselves. In the last case study, the assessor employee tried to say that the property value increased by $100,000 because there was backsplash on the MLS pictures between sale 1 and sale 2. And that same day, the backsplash was on clearance at Home Depot for 39 cents a foot. The other thing they'll say is that the price per square foot is irrelevant. That's kind of true and kind of not. And they'll say if somebody listed their house for sale and it never closed, that cannot be considered as a comp. So that goes to your question earlier, Nina. FSBOs that don't close really don't count. Are there any more questions that have come up since we've been talking?
Yes. I kind of lost. Yes, the recording will be shared with the group. Blah, blah, blah. How many miles away can the comparable homes be?
Well, a good residential appraiser that works for a bank, I think a bank would be hard put to accept anything greater than a half mile or a mile at the most. The assessor's office kind of deems themselves exempt. There's another interesting rule. I own a house that has had a couple unpermitted additions, and the ceiling height is less than 6 feet in those additions. And the assessor is claiming the whole square footage on their assessment, but there's an ANSI standard that if the ceiling height is less than 6'8", the the square footage is not counted. And so what I'm telling the assessor, it's actually a 250 square foot house, and they want to pretend it's 800. So we've done like 7 site visits. They still won't update their records, but it is a national standard of appraisals that they try to ignore. And I think with distances, there's standards around that as well.
Where the Denver class is listed in the comps, my property is listed as a B, but compared to C and CD, what does this category mean? And does the fact that I'm comped to lower classes weaken my case for an appeal?
I think nothing weakens your case for an appeal. So I think they'll throw things in there, and if you let that get you down and discourage you from protesting, they're achieving their objective, but it's not achieving yours. At each sale, there's is it called a TD 1000, where you disclose the property condition and you say whether the seller included the fridge and the washing machine and stuff like that. So they can kind of put some data in their assessor database. That's garbage. I see a lot of people saying their property is a D or an F, even though it's not, just to throw the assessor off. Really, I think the basis is pull up those properties on the MLS or on Zillow, look at the pictures, and then tell the assessor how wrong their data is.
Yeah, I think that's all I have right now. So I'll mute myself if you want to keep moving forward.
Yeah, great. So some time savers for protesting your value. If you did a refinance during the basis period, that appraisal is gold. You can just submit that at that value, assuming it's lower, of course. Go for it, Vanessa.
As a lender, most of the refis done during that time period had appraisal waivers. So while I've put them out, my clients, there were not many. So ask your lender if you had an appraisal. And if you did, you probably remembered it because you paid for it.
Right, exactly. It cost $600 or
waiver, and that just meant that Fannie Mae accepted the value and you didn't need one. So there really weren't many. For the amount of refinances that were done, there were not that many appraisals done.
That's a great point. Thank you, Vanessa. If you bought during the basis period, that sale is your best comp. And I think that's universally true. And any appraiser would say that's true. The Boulder assessor wants to disabuse us of that truth. But really, one of the reasons I'm here, like my business is being a rental inspector, and maybe I'm an author too, but I'm here giving this presentation because I am so incensed with some of the assessors getting way outside of good appraisal guidelines to collect more money. And I think part of it is that mill levy. There's some Tabor state laws that it can't fluctuate that much. And so if the government needs more money, they can get it by inflating our assessments, but they can't just change the mill levy. But regardless, our government needs to remain honest about our valuations. And I hope all of you, if you find your valuation to be a little higher than it should be, that you take a little time and submit something in writing and help them identify where they may have misappraised your house. If your neighbor has a similar house, or often some neighborhoods have identical houses, and if they got an appraisal, or if they bought or sold, use that. I mean, that is really gold. Nina is a great agent, so she may offer to help some people pull comps if that's something you're up for, Nina.
Sure. One other point that I know you mentioned, like at the beginning of the cycle, 2020, that the city was using, 35% valuation. I think the key is trying to find comps that are much lower, that are closing in the beginning of 2022. So that's right, not inflated as much. And so that's really the key, is if you can focus on finding more current comps for 2022, that can really help your cause.
That's a really great insight, Nina. Yeah, yesterday I protested 2 properties, and I changed my search to only look for 21 and the first half of 22 comps, because otherwise they'll time adjust that sale by more than the market went up, and it just defeats the whole purpose of using comps. Yeah.
And somebody asked about when the time period started. So the comps need to be between July 1st, 2020 and June 30th, 2022.
Correct.
Like Hasso said, if you can find comps more at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, that's going to help your cause more.
Right, because they're a 30% adjustment times over 2 years just takes your value from 900,000 to 1.3 million, that kind of thing. And so they get money on fake movements of the market. But one thing I've learned over the years, when I first started buying real estate and I was younger and maybe a little angrier, like be like, I bought this place for 135. How can they say it's worth 600? And I would just get so angry and like trembly. And I'd be like, how could you? And what I've really learned is niceness works better. We're all more likely to help a nice person. Some negotiating trainer says, never antagonize something who can hurt you by doing nothing. So help the assessor save face, tell them how hard their job is, and then state the facts, ask for fairness with kindness. And the other thing with those in-person hearings, show up. It's actually kind of amazing to me that people will schedule them, confirm them, and then not show up. I literally was at an appeals hearing, and the assessor employee sent me an email thanking me for showing up, that he had been there all morning and nobody else showed up except I. And he appreciated that. So sometimes you get surprised in a good way. The other thing is really expect the unexpected. So we have till June 8th to submit our appeal. But last cycle, I think the final day was on a Monday. So I was working the weekend trying to get stuff done. The Denver assessment protest site was down the weekend. And the state law actually doesn't allow them to give extensions, even if the city totally screwed something up and it's totally their fault we couldn't submit a protest. Similarly, the Jeffco assessment protest site was up, but they were claiming they accepted attachments up to 10 megabytes. A 5 megabyte attachment wouldn't go through. It just failed to upload. And so with Jeffco, I then went to Office Depot, printed it in color, mailed my protest packet from Office Depot, and they miscalculated the postage by 20 cents. And instead of the assessor, sometimes the receiver can pay it, they returned it to me. Then I drove out on the last day and slid the packet under the assessor's door, but I got there because of traffic, 8 minutes after 5 p.m. They rejected me hand delivering it because it was received after close of business. Later, 2 months later, they mailed me a postcard admitting that they had some kind of screw up and that they're granted extensions due to their technical error. So I resubmitted my protest, and then I got it mailed back to me saying that, oh, mine didn't fit their criteria, and it was exempt from that resubmission. Then there's a way to file a petition for abatement, and that's an interesting thing. You could file a petition for abatement for the taxes you paid this year that were assessed in the 2021 valuation cycle. Jeffco had told me it would take 3 months. It actually took 9. So all these processes, just do it early, make sure they receive it. Yeah, give yourself some breathing room. And then, I've tried to impart you with some information in this webinar, but I wrote a book. It's $9.99 on Amazon. I actually make $2.33 on it, but it's a fast read. It's designed to kind of inspire you to know how to do this and to succeed with the assessor, with a process that isn't very accessible for us, but that we need to learn to kind of have some grasp of if we're going to keep our housing costs manageable. And then if you search for assessor in Denver or Jeffco or whatever your county is, you'll get some more detailed assessment and protest info specific to your county with the process, the web forums where you could protest online. They'll give you some guidelines that are partially helpful. And then if you do need a Denver rental inspector, you'll find me on the registry with the info you see on your screen. I'll take more questions if you have any.
I have sort of a gestalt question, if that's okay. So let's say we don't want to go through the hassle of having site inspections. We don't really feel like going through a lot of the in-person investigations, things of that nature. If we just wanted to submit a complaint online, what would you recommend is our strongest argument that we can do in a relatively quick and easy way, given that we don't want to go through the whole 2 and 3 phase process, especially considering the 3rd phase sounds like it's a wash anyway. What route do you think we should best take? Is it just submitting comps or what?
It's a really beautiful question, and there's a few parts to it. The first one is the site visit is only for things where, like I say, you have to exclude 60% of the square footage because of the ceiling height, and they're like, "Oh, we don't believe you," and I'm like, "Well, come look at it." And the other one was the brick and stucco, where it's actually like paper mache siding. Again, they've looked at it 7 times. They've refused to update their records 7 times. But for a normal house where I'm not disputing their data, and maybe with the 3 to 4 bedroom question, they might do a site visit if you told them you had 4 bedrooms. But for normal assessments, you won't have them come to your house. For the first step, you won't even have the hearing. So the first step, submit something. I actually find this is really interesting. The way I do it, the first one is kind of sloppy, and I'll see what they come back with. And sometimes they'll be surprisingly reasonable, and that's all I need to do. Sometimes they'll just be kind of screw you, like, oh, we're taking $1,000 off or denied totally. And I'm like, no, that's not right. And I'll do a better resubmission, which is 30 days from the letter I get responding to my first appeal. And then based on that resubmission, they'll contact me back with potentially another reduction. And if they choose not to give me a reduction, then we schedule that hearing. So what you asked about, like saving time, like find some comps that are better, submit them, and just let the process unfold. And you get to opt out at any point in time. But if you don't protest now, you don't get to choose to participate or opt out later.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I've seen a number of assessments from Denver County that do not have comps listed. Why? While some do have a list of comps, why is this, and what do you suggest?
That's a really great question. I have a 5-plex that has 3 structures on a parcel, and they don't list comps, but they actually have 3 different sets of comps that they can't fit on their form. So if you call or email the assessor's office, they'll email you what they used.
Is there a way to combat the fact that March through June of 22 was absolutely out of control with 20 to 40% over list?
That's this. I mean, this is a boon for the assessor and a real negative for us. I mean, we were all happy then too, because we're like, wow, we're all want to be millionaires. But yeah, that's just life. Yeah.
What has happened historically in Denver with huge increases in assessed values and appeals as is happening now?
Like a recession afterwards? Or what was your question?
So I'm just reading what the chat said. What has happened historically in Denver with huge increases in assessed values and appeals, like what's happening now? What have the other cycles kind of given, do you know, with appeals?
I mean, I'm sure that with this kind of increase, they should have an increased volume of appeals. And possibly just the fact that they have an increased volume could make them more willing to be reasonable. Because I feel like when they say property values, so when I plugged in my whole portfolio and based on their increases, I'm paying $15,000 more in property tax. So my property tax burden goes from $35,000 to $50,000 a year. That's a big thing to pass on to 40 tenants. I mean, 15,000 over 40 tenants is a lot, plus 10,000 in trash. But I think they have such a run up in values that they don't need the values to be that high for Denver to get its budgetary needs met. So if you protest, you have a chance of them easing off on that. That could be, I can't guarantee that, but I'd like to think that. And that's good for you guys getting educated on this process, because there's a lot of people. I've talked to some very seasoned investors who just throw up their hands and they're like, oh, I feel like I'm powerless. And they just don't do anything and just pay the money. And I think that's not the right approach. So do protest.
Actually, this is my question. This is Roger. I'm asking more like in terms of historical, like in 1962, the city would have similarly increased taxes on properties like this, or in 1942 or whatever. I don't know if you did any studies in relationship to historical increases like this.
No, I saw something when New York City passed rent controls in 1945, and then by 1947, some huge number of landlords had filed bankruptcy, like 30 or 50% of landlords. But around property taxes, I haven't seen those studies, but Harry Helmsley was a big operator in New York City during that time. And what he said is, all we've become, if we're landlords, are rent collectors for the city. Like, we take money from the tenants and give it to the city, and we have to raise rents without actually profiting at all. But in terms of, I think what the historical cycle is that there's, ups and downs. And if there's an up, there may be a down following, but we're doing so much with stimulation of the economy that we've been staving off down cycles as well.
Thank you. I guess while I had the question, I have another question, which is I read about the governor and or state and or city council trying to pass legislation to change these assessed values. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Nina talked about that. And I don't know if you want to jump in on this.
Yeah, so Roger, there's Bill 23303 that is currently going through the legislature. And I think it needs to go in front of the voters in November. So basically what it's going to do is probably do a reduction of the mill levy, where they're going to give a tax break. And so they're still working on that. But from what I heard, that you may need to go through this new process to get your rate decreased. It's still kind of up in the air. I'm going to try to find out as much information and when that's going to get approved. And I don't know when our Colorado legislature, when their last day is. So
I called the assessor's office about that one, and I have the numbers directionally correct. So residential property is based on some factor. It's like 6.7%. And then commercial property is assessed at like 24%. It's like roughly 4 times the value of residential. They were creating another tax category for residential rental property that was like 7.1%. So it was essentially like about 10% more than owner-occupied residential property for residential rental property. So landlords would pay roughly 10% more in property tax, would be the outcome of that bill if it passes.
So someone just made a comment that the last day of the legislature was yesterday. So if people look up Bill 23303, that will describe what they ended up with. And I believe that now needs to go to the voters in November. So that will be on the ballot for voters to vote what the legislature came up with.
Interesting. I've seen Denver voters vote for some things that I feel like are bad for our society. And so that worries me.
Yeah. Someone made a comment of they've got a property in, I think, Arapahoe and Grand, and there were no comps used. How can they protest? Can they go ahead and still pull comps that they feel are relevant?
Yeah, no, I think in those cases, and Jeffco does it, and Boulder's starting to, and I feel like this is where the assessor misuses their authority and they just make up a value and don't substantiate how they got to it. And actually, I was reading about appraisal, and appraisal as a pseudoscience is about substantiating how you project this made up value, and essentially the assessor, when they don't give you comps, they refuse to substantiate it. Your job is to actually find real comps and do their job and come up with a better number and submit to that to them and hope that they accept it. And they often will. Yeah.
And Hasso, I do have a question. If somebody protested and they provide comps and the city was like, oh, these comps are actually making your house worth more, is there a chance that somebody's property taxes could go up instead of going down? Could their assessed value increase if they don't do the right comps?
Yes, but you know, we're all intelligent people. Just we know how to use Zoom. You're not going to submit comps that are worth more. Like, just don't do that.
I think the time adjustment is if you pick comps that are early in the cycle and you don't realize that there's that time adjustment, that could actually cause your taxes to go higher. So if you're picking stuff from 2020 and then the city does a time adjustment of 35%, it could actually be negative. Does that make sense?
It's a fair question, and I appreciate the person asking for it. So I want to mention something about the Denver assessor, because I think some of our when we opened our mail, it was a shock. When we go in for that in-person hearing, and it's easy, you've seen it on online forums, people can be really mean to the anonymous on the anonymous forum. When you're dealing with a person, there's some kindness in there. Like they're like, oh wow, like you showed up and look what you did, and by our factors it'd be worth more, and they would kind of just pat you on the back and tell you to go home and leave the value where it is. They're not going to be that evil. Like especially in Denver, I've seen the assessor's office have moments of really great kindness. So I want you to know, if you show up as a good human, there are some good humans there too. And just by showing up, you're not like digging your own grave. Like I wouldn't be that worried about it. But it's back to Nina's point earlier. If you're going to use comps, like basically take that, if you divide 30% by 24 and count how many months it is between the sale date and the end of the basis period, you can project what they're going to raise it by for their time adjustment factor. And you can recreate that. Like it's fairly simple arithmetic. And then use comps from the beginning of 2022. So the first half of 2022. And that way that time adjustment won't mess with the numbers. And the hard part with that is one more thing is it was so crazy in that first half of 2022 and slowed down so much in July of 2022 that I was trying to comp a property and I just could not find good comps, and I'm going to just let it go. But that's one of the things we have to look at is it's not worth protesting if you can't have a leg to stand on when you protest.
I have a question. I bought a townhouse in Grand County. It's a new build in end of October. So if they're pulling comps end of June and the inventory is very low, what would be the best way to protest? And they're saying that my value is worth about 100,000 more than I purchased. That was just 6 months ago, and it's just not possible.
Wait, you bought it after the basis period?
Yeah, I bought the property in October. I closed in October 2022.
Okay.
And their valuation came up about 100,000 more than I paid for when I closed.
I would just send a really kind letter and say, hey, I went to some seminar on property tax and I learned that a property is its own best comp, and what people are willing to pay on the open market is what a property is worth. And I don't understand how it could have gone up for 100,000, and maybe put a little sob story about a financial situation, and you're respectfully asking them to revise the value to the sale price. And you might actually just get them to agree to you to some degree.
Should I just send in my appraisal?
Yes, perfect. That's it. Use that. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. The house next to mine sold, and it's exactly the same model as my house and same size and everything. And it sold for way over ask. But so there's a lot of comps, even more recent, that are lower per square foot. But do you think the fact that it's my next door, neighbor, and it was in the time frame, it was like January 2022, is going to be? Do they only need one comp? Because no other comp will justify that, but that's what they assessed my house at was based on that comp.
Typically, a good appraiser uses 3 to 5 comps, and that's why Denver will give you 3 to 5 comps. So if you threw that one in the mix with 4 others, that outlier doesn't give the average value of all those that much of a boost. And I would try to just argue that their landscaping is better, or they have, you're on a corner lot and therefore have more traffic and they don't. Or if you could try to somehow cast doubt on that comp and submit other comps, you could still try to get a reduction.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and they really know it's your next door neighbor, and they're busy. I mean, they're taking 10 minutes to look at this and make a decision. Like, give them some data to chew on and ask for what you're going to ask for and see what they come back with.
Hasso, do you want to go ahead to the last slide?
Sure.
I think we have answered most of the questions, and I know most people are heading out, but I hope Hasso has given you some good things to think about and what you can do. So a couple of people mentioned, how do I get comps? So one, if you've got a realtor connection, the person who helped you buy your house, reach out to them first. You know, they're your first line of defense. If you don't have someone, I do have some very limited time that I can help, but you have to understand that there has to be a case there. So if you kind of bought at a time and there really aren't any comps, there may not be much that we can do to help. But I would definitely look at your new assessment, see how they rated your house. It could be, like Hasso mentioned, that there could be some things that they got wrong that you can easily correct, you know, the condition, the size, the bedrooms. So there's some things that you can do on your own. And then for comps, like I said, reach out to your realtor. You've got my contact info. Vanessa may be able to help out as well. But there's lots that you can do. For anyone who's a landlord, we do have a free Facebook page. It's called Toilets to Tenants. It's a great place to post questions, to get information, to understand new legislature. And it's free to join. So you can reach out to either Vanessa or myself, and we'll give you info on how you can find us. And then, like I mentioned, we do periodic meetings. You know, we've been doing Zoom since COVID. So we will have a meeting coming up in the next like 2 months or so. So anything, Hasso, that you want to do to wrap up?
I just wanted to appreciate you, Nina, and Vanessa for hosting me, and everybody who showed up. Like, really great job for being here. We all have the responsibility to be informed voters and to help steer our democracy in the right direction. So to help the assessor do the right thing. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and end this meeting.
Have a great morning. Thank you, everybody.